the microfiscal assessment of countries and their ability to pay their debt, we probably need to be much more granular to look at real capacity of countries to pay their debt. Because it's almost as if once you do your debt to GDP assessment and say, oh, you are 56, you are 50, even if you're paying with 10% of your revenue to service debt is fine. And look at the other nuances that really shows that countries in the long term are not sustainable. I mean, for example, we're talking about Ghana's case where for over a decade, we have seen the gap between expenditure and revenue expanding over time, growing from about 10% to a point where we got to almost 80%. So you are spending far more than the so-called GDP can actually give you as a country. And we also do know that government expenditure is part of the GDP calculations on the plus side. So you get governments going to the market, go and take $3 billion in a single year, and we don't care what that money actually goes into. And I mean, in normal sense, even in business, if you can show that even if you are getting at 10%, 8%, the investment can actually pay for the debt that you are procuring, you wouldn't have a problem. But in our context, those are not important. The appetite to borrow is far weightier than thinking through how you repay your debt. And that's really the problem. I mean, at one point in COVID period, we had $1 billion sitting in a bank at 8%, doing nothing. I mean, how do you borrow with that to pay 8% and deliver nothing with it for a whole year? So it means that the program for the borrowing was not as robust as it should be for you to be able to repay. And the investments that we actually put some of the money into. I mean, for example, if you track borrowings over time and how much actually goes into investment, it's around 30%. So what it tells you is that much of the borrowing is going into consumption. So that also exposes your ability to pay for those high interest loans. And then what is even going to investment, the quality of the investments, the corruption in there, we're not able to net that off to actually see what investments are going to be done. And also government is competing with the private sector in areas where they don't have to, right? Because they can go and borrow and just throw it into the economy. They prefer to do it themselves rather than the private sector do it. Most of the roads, big mega projects that are being delivered, there are example templates for government to work with the private sector to deliver them. But because of the corruption, they prefer to deliver it as a government project. All right? I mean, Senegal has shown the way where they tied investment into recovery through tolls. And in some of the roads, they are charging as much as $10 a trip just to be able to pay because they have modeled it and realized that that is the only way you can actually pay. But government prefer to do it for free and drop it into the economy without showing the pathway to do it. And I think that's where the conversation tomorrow also feed into this. How do we link these kinds of inefficiencies into the conversation? Because forgiving you today doesn't mean that tomorrow you won't come back. And suddenly the market is also realizing that it's not enough to sit in London and New York and be giving B+, C-, and the rest of it. You have to restructure if the funds are not actually utilized the way they should. Yeah. Thank
you. Thank you. This has been extremely informative, insightful panel. My name is Samah Salman. I'm from Sudan. Sudan, we have a case which is one of the largest HIPC cases, but $40 billion in external debt, which is about 70% of GDP. So my question is, in César's talk, he mentioned possible ideas to help with the debt. One of them is mechanisms to encourage private sector participation. So I'm just curious to know how could the private sector help? Is it about projects to increase productivity and revenue? Is it about technical kind of assistance? What is it that the private sector can contribute? Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Isaac Adongo from Ghana once again. I have a strong feeling that the multilaterals have failed us. We are focused on their sustainability when we come for Article 4 reviews. We are very happy to report global growth, but we are not interested in the fiscal environment under which we deliver that growth. We are not interested in the level of external vulnerabilities that we face as countries. And we are not interested in analyzing our budget to see how reasonable they are and whether they are sustainable enough. The end result is that we don't have this conversation that we could have preempted long ago. And I give you an example. In Ghana, we have a 2023 budget that basically is not implementable. But IMF keeps telling us that that budget is responsive to the IMF program. And when you look at that budget, your total budget is about 20 billion, including deficit, $20 billion. Out of that, you are looking for $8.5 billion from the very people you owe that you cannot pay. Okay. So that gives you about 11.5 billion of domestic resources. The people you owe that you cannot pay, you need to pay them 7.5 billion out of that money. So you are left with 4.1 billion. It can't pay your compensation to your workers in 1 year. And the IMF says this is consistent with the solution they are bringing. So quite clearly, from day one, we don't have a solution, even with the IMF program, unless we are willing to have an honest, non-diplomatic conversation about the way forward about economies. We are being treated as if we are kids that will fear to cry if you touch us a little harder. But that is what we need now. I want to find out how the IMF and the World Bank going forward would not just come and look at debt coverage and extend our ability to pay based on some artificial indicators for the next 10 years and pronounce judgment on us, as opposed to whether the level of fiscal risks that we are carrying on are sustainable and how do we address that. You mentioned that about 60% of our debts are in domestic holdings with 40% external. But in that 60%, non-resident holdings is 30%. So you are looking at external holding in excess of 50%. That immediately puts pressure on your currency because you become externally vulnerable. You can generate all the cedis you want, but you cannot externalize them with cedis. You need to find the dollars. Your exports are not growing. Okay, and what you do is to cut and paste. You go out there, take 3 billion and come and paste. And you look fine. Then when the people become alarmed and they freeze the computer and you cannot cut and bring 3 billion, you suddenly realize that you have a liquidity challenge. So we have a country now that cannot get in money from outside. Because of the domestic debt exchange program also, the domestic capital market is gone. So how do you finance a budget where you cannot get external resources? Your citizens are wary. They no longer believe that government is the most safest place to put your money. And yes, you might deliver service. So there's a very hard conversation, but I see this because it's not happening in the West. It's happening somewhere else. If this situation that we find in Africa was somewhere in Europe, like it happened in Greece and Spain, the conversation will be different. And there's a sense in which we must democratize these multilateral institutions in order that the right voices are heard in the right places. In the absence of that, we'll keep gathering here. Africans will gather in groups, lament our woes, and go back and continue life as normal. Thank you very much.
Good morning. My name is Beauty Mefanate. I think earlier speakers have said some of the issues I wanted to allude to. But in all this, I wanted to understand how do we position the citizen? Debt is incurred on behalf of the citizen, but citizens are not brought to the fore when it comes to these conversations. Another challenge I have is about debt transparency. We have experienced that in Ghana. We only got to realize how much our total debt is when Ghana was going under the program. As citizens, we had difficulty getting that information. And that, unfortunately, does not help in issues of transparency. As our speaker from Zambia earlier talked about, that is not self-inflicting. I have challenges when we say it is not self-inflicting and at the same time admit that there are leakages, there are issues of corruption, there are issues of value for money not respected, and even how those debts are used. We have not even been able to audit what we even use the monies for. We all know in election year what happens, and Ghana is going to face that. And upon all that, citizens have been asked to tighten their belts. But unfortunately, those who lead the forefront to get us there have not shown that we are in crisis or we are in distress. And these are some of the challenges as citizens. How do we show that truly we have gotten here and there's the need? And I think that I want to understand from César, how is the World Bank and the IMF positioning themselves to enable citizens have enough transparency with these processes? Thank you very much.
Okay, sorry, before you, we've got about 20 minutes left. So if I may kindly ask that the remaining contributions are very precise so that we allow the speakers to conclude. Thank you.
Yeah, I want
respond and conclude.
Yeah, I want to talk much. I'm Janice Adeyemi from Nigeria and Women in Mining and the Extractives. I think the questions have been well put together, but my own worry is that everything said, the issue of discipline, the fiscal discipline is not mentioned. And I believe, and I say it all the time, that if only African leaders can demonstrate by example, because let's look at our individual households. When you have problems, you readjust your lifestyle. But the lifestyle, the fiscal discipline is not there. And we keep on talking. The leakages are not addressed. And a time is going to come. Yesterday, somebody asked in the session, what's World Bank and IMF interest in Africa? If you are giving loan and the loan is not well utilized and it's piling up and the citizens are suffering, then what is the interest? I just want to put it to you directly rather than go around the bend. That is why if you look at César's intervention, César never, even in trying to come up with solutions, I think there's a major omission. And the omission is the civil society space. Most civil society organizations that are here today funded themselves to come here. At least I funded myself to come here because of the interest I have for what I do. Officials will not do that. They have to get ESTA codes and everything to be able to come out fine. So we are as civil society organizations, you understand, in this structural adjustment debate. So I think it's very important. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. I'm Jean-Paul Djemba from Mata Capital. We are advising governments and corporates across the continent. And I would like to bring a different angle to this conversation in terms of, looking at the costs of debt a bit differently. I think we've been talking to governments that the cost of debt is not just, the interest rate you are contracting in the commissions or whatever that you are paying, but it's also, the cost of, the currency when it fluctuates, right? So we're seeing our African governments borrowing in dollars and so forth and euros. And then all these currencies are fluctuating daily, right, against their local currency. And they have to mobilize local resources to repay them. And with the currency volatility that we have seen, right, people are looking at, not only, it compounds on the fluctuation of the commodities prices, the currency pricing, and the loans interest, right? So everybody was happy when we had a negative Euribor. We had the, the Federal Reserve Bank having the base rate, at 0.5, 0.25. And when we're talking to countries like, this is the right time to do an interest rate hedging to fix it when it's low, right? Some have done it, some have not done it. And the currency hedging, this is in our hands. We cannot have the World Bank and IMF and the fiscal policies solving all the problems, right? So the major oil companies, the major traders, they are hedging for themselves. So not hedging is like, driving your car without an insurance, right? So we're having the resources, right? So we have gas, we have oil, and all these commodities, copper. We went to Zambia when, the prices of copper was very high. And when we're talking about hedging against future receivables, in terms of copper revenues, everybody was very positive. Oh, we are fine. We went to Ghana, Ghana, we have oil. So why do we need to hedge? And I think that, these elements are very important for the countries to understand that they cannot just, produce oil, minerals, and not doing anything about it in terms of capping the cost or hedging for their future receivables. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Henry Elonga. I'm a teacher at Clark Atlanta University. I know this is not the best place to talk about default on the loans. I had an experience with Bank of America at a credit limit of $60,000. By no fault of my own, they canceled it. I'd refused to pay. After 2 years, the bank called me and we renegotiated the debt. And I've completed the debt on my own terms. So I would want to urge African countries to think about default. It will be costly, but in the long run, they will survive. Otherwise, we are papering over the cracks. Yes, from 350 billion, now it is 1.114 trillion. The second way is to look at what happened to oil. The cost of our raw materials are undervalued. If African countries can add value to their raw materials and take that balance, what they derive from those added value to defray the cost of their debt servicing and so on, that will be an argument that civil societies need to argue, than to start arguing that there's actually something wrong with the Africans, African governments, African people. Some of you here have been government officials, studying in the best schools. There's nothing wrong with them. Their hands are tied by 114 trillion, 1.14 trillion debt. If you went into that position, what would you do? You would be confronted by that reality. So I would urge that either we begin to argue with the West, especially, and the gains that will come from any climate change concessions should be used to defray the cost of the debt. And the value that they put, we can value cocoa 2 or 3 times the present cost, and that balance will be used to pay the debt. So I think we should look for unorthodox ways to correct this problem. Otherwise, next year it will be 2.8 trillion.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The very last one.
I'm just going to be very quick. My name is Emmanuel from Ghana. I just want us to also bring in to reflect on whether debt servicing is only an economic issue or it's a development issue. And I say so because if you look at the world today, we are faced with 2 emergencies. Not only the economic recovery emergency, but we're also faced with climate emergency. And a lot of the monies that Africans or maybe developing countries borrow, they borrow to also build infrastructure. And you ask yourself, what happened? What caused this infrastructure to be deteriorated at a faster rate? A lot of them also come from climate-induced deterioration. So we are at a point that we cannot take the issue of climate financing or diverse climate financing from debt servicing. We need to bring the two together. And that is why I keep on asking people from the World Bank, IMF, why is it that debt for climate swap is not an option? Because if US and China alone are contributing at least 30% of global emissions, and these are the two countries that probably most African countries or developing countries are also owing that much, why can't we, as an option, as an innovation, consider swapping, our debts, so that instead of African countries paying those debts or servicing those debts, they would rather divert that money into financing their climate mitigation programs. This is something that probably we should also put on the table for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have exactly 10 minutes and 4 speakers. So it's about 2.5 minutes for everyone, for each of you. There were some comments in there, so please feel free to acknowledge them in your responses. But I think the questions here from Sudan, I think that was very direct to César about the role of the private sector. I think there was a question there about how the private sector can come in and support. I think the question from Beauty on the role of the citizen, where do we position the citizen in this conversation? And there was one on what is the interest of the fund at the bank and the role of citizens. And then I think the point from the gentleman from the private sector talking about hedging, I think I'd be interested actually both for Ed and Grieve to touch on this, and given the resource-rich component of Ghana and Zambia, respectively. And the point from Henry on default, you're not the only person who has been referring to this idea of default. And I think maybe, César, you might also want to come in here and tell us what, how the bank might react if countries came in and decided they wanted to do a collective default there. And then Jane can talk a bit more about the architectural and fiscal discipline aspects of this. And in all of that, if you could also incorporate your closing remarks so that we can, small request there. So maybe we'll start with you, César, and then we'll come back into the room.
Okay, thank you so much. It's just such a series of very interesting questions. I will try to be as brief as possible and try to touch as much as I can. But this conversation can continue offline at any time. In the case of private sector participation, there are 2 things. One is try to encourage, one from the standpoint of the debt negotiation, and the other one from the standpoint of reigniting growth. Because one thing that Africans need is growth, right? In the case of debt renegotiation, we need to design mechanisms so the private creditors can participate from the start in the negotiations. No, it's not that, let's talk only official governments and then, filter the information to private creditors. I think we need to be transparent in that stand, and that's why this initiative of sharing the DSA with all creditors involved. From the growth standpoint, if you think about the current funding squeeze that we have, right, and the sluggish global growth, African countries would need to rely on their own domestic space to try to reignite growth. And one of the things that needs to be done is to bolster private sector investment. What can private sector contribute? Contributes technology know-how, managerial know-how. But the idea is that that technological transfer, which can come from private investors domestically or private investors abroad, has to stay in the country and has to help companies grow. As companies grow, they're going to be able to create jobs. The issue on the citizens, that's a very important issue because citizens in their own countries need to have a voice and accountability. You know, I mean, I think part of the idea, part of the push towards more transparency, is to try to suggest countries. I mean, we don't have any power of enforcement, but try to suggest countries or try to ask countries to be transparent in terms of the loan contracts, including the terms and conditions, to be public, and also to publish the execution of these contracts. That would give information for citizens and for civil society to assess and monitor the use of these funds and whether these funds are being used productively or not. That would be one step for citizens to at least monitor whether those funds are being used productively for the benefit of all the citizens in the country. Regarding the cost of debt, yeah, I agree. I mean, one of the things that is happening, I mean, with governments borrowing in foreign currency during these last decades, of course, currency risks have increased. But you know, in case of currency hedging, I mean, we have spoke, a lot in the bank over the last 5 to 7 years about currency hedging. But that involves something very important, which is try to have policies that develop the financial system in African countries, right? Because sometimes these hedging instruments are not there. Sometimes you can resort to external markets to have those hedging instruments, but sometimes you need to resort also to domestic markets, especially if you need to protect citizens, households from these risks. In case of default, okay, so this is not a trivial question, and again, I mean, it has a lot of nuances, right? The first thing that we need to know is whether the country is solvent or not. If the country is insolvent and there's no way that they're going to be, it's not going to be able to repay its debt, there are two solutions. One, restructure the loan in a way that you lengthen the maturity. So basically, what you're doing is delaying payments of interest and principal for a time that will allow, in the meantime, countries to grow and generate those resources and recover their ability to repay. And if that process takes too much time and the country is still insolvent, maybe there should be margin to discuss some sort of debt cancellation. But again, this is something that needs to be decided on a case by case, given not only the debt situation but also the growth prospects of the country, because that is crucial to determine the capacity to repay. And I think there is, and I think I'll stop here. Sorry.
Great, thank you. So maybe I'll start with Grieves, and then we'll go to Ed, and then we'll finish with Jane.
Thanks, Jason. I mean, a lot came out of today, and it's very interesting to react to some of the comments that came on from the floor. The one thing that I really want to put across here is, empirically and historically, the swings in the economic performance of African countries has always been driven by external factors, not in a nefarious way, right? Sometimes in a nefarious way, because there have been coups, there have been, people have been deposed, but sometimes in just the way the sizes of our economies are so susceptible to external factors. Swings in commodity cycles, somebody did mention it. The gentleman here talked about monetary policy by the US Fed. These are the factors which drive economic performance in African countries. There's very little that African governments can do given the structure of the world economy. Even if you're 120% fiscally disciplined, these things will still hit you in a very devastating way. And this is important in thinking about how do we get from here to there. It's incredibly important, and I think it's useful that friends in the audience begin to think about the challenges. I think that the gentleman from Clark made the point about there's very little that you can do. If I was thrust today into the position of Minister of Finance in Zambia, and I think I'd like to believe I'm an ethical guy. I don't think I want to bling up and buy a Mercedes-Benz, but even that would not be enough to protect my country from these swings in the global economy, right? And these are useful things to think about structurally. How do we structure our own economies in such a way that we can insulate ourselves from these global dynamics? And part of it requires that we think about Kwame Nkrumah's idea, people from Ghana, of working as a bloc. That might be a way to protect oneself. But I want to quickly talk about, I think hedging is an interesting idea. César also touched about it. The one thing that it's useful to have private sector participation in these things, but also it's always important to have the state to take a proactive role. So sovereign wealth funds, for example, are important instruments, right? In times when commodity prices are high, can the state save, right, and put some money away in the bank for times when things are bad? And I want to talk about default. Interesting idea from the gentleman from Clark. And I think César talked about some of the problems, but again, default is difficult to implement if you're working alone as Zambia. Yeah. They will punish you. They'll completely punish you. I mean, empirically, and Argentina has defaulted sometimes, and the penalty has been small for Argentina because they default and they go back and borrow again. The reason why they can do that is they're sizable, in a sense. So if we're thinking about default as a strategy, we do it together. Right? Then you threaten, Otherwise, Zambia does it alone, will be punished and will never borrow again and be shut out. Climate swap from Emmanuel, a great idea. I really like it because a lot of the problems we're facing now, we didn't create them. Those who industrialized before us polluted, messed things up for us, and now we're paying the price. So can we do this climate for debt swap thing? I find it incredibly interesting, and I think it's a great idea, right? So anyways, there's so much one can say. I leave it here and leave it for my other colleagues.
Thank you very much. Ed, and then Jane.
Yeah, thank you. I think there are a few critical issues that we also need to look at, because I think there's already an ongoing conversation among African finance ministers in how to, continue to, negotiate and discuss with the IFIs on the issue of the global financial architecture and the whole issue of about the African voice in trying to influence the common framework, the reform of the World Bank, and all those things. So that there are ongoing conversations in this area, which is important. It's just to respond to your point about where we are now between the devil and the deep blue sea, right? That, we are not able to get out of this conundrum. But I think there are two issues I just wanted to make. One is on the supply side. I think we've all been talking about debt and all that. But on the demand side, the accountability issues that the gentleman raised earlier is very important. And there has been some ongoing conversation about the Borrowers Club. I don't know how far that is going on. But that would help, as he said, about the whole issue of coming together as a bloc to be able to negotiate in a much more substantive way is very, very important. But at the same time, when we're looking at the fiscal regime of many of these countries, there is not adequate link between the fiscal framework and the industrial policy. We need to grow the economy. And you can only begin to mobilize domestic resources in a substantive way if the private sector is growing and creating jobs. This is very fundamental. So when we talk about domestic resource mobilization, Ghana, we've now, I don't know, about 20 or 4 levies, which have been just recently and still counting. And when you look at most of them, they are going to stifle private sector growth. The very goose that lays the golden egg, So I think these are issues that we need to take care of. If we are really going to reduce debt dependency and begin to grow the economy, the whole issue of the regional integration and so on is also very important. That as a bloc, we can become more effective in delivering our agenda to the whole world, right? So I just want to end there.
Thank you very much, Jane.
Okay, thank you so much for the very, very interesting comments. You talked about the issue of the fiscal discipline is very important. issues around, we have been talking about the prudent use of our resources. What we have, let us use it prudently. Let us reinvest it. And maybe we can be able to grow the economy, like Edward is saying. Two, I think it's important to rethink the democratic deficit in all these global institutions, the bank, the fund, the WTO. When you talk about the campaign being rule takers, it means there is a lack of democracy. And we are here, like we were saying yesterday, telling people we are in a debt crisis. And they said, no, you are still fine. You know, that lack of, democracy. I think we need to democratize these institutions. And I think that's why a number of people here, we are, the campaign around bringing the UN to take charge of some of these issues, because that's where we all have a voice. And also to reform the trade and financial architecture. Grieve, you were saying we can't do anything given the current structure of the economy, the agreements we sign, the way the financial and trade architecture is, we can't as Africa be able to do a lot. So we need that reform. And the debate is on. In the World Trade Organization, there is a debate that let us reform the WTO. The IMF, the fund and the bank provides concessional loans, technical advice, technical assistance, and policy advice. But I think we need to analyze of the policy advice. Speaking for my country, all the advice they give us, we do it. We don't even ask, when they tell us to jump, we don't ask how high, we jump. But we have been consistently doing what they tell us. But this is where we are. I think we need to address the efficacy of the advice. Yesterday again, was it the other day, we are discussing the issue of capital controls. Should we have capital controls? They are saying no, don't. You don't. It isn't good for you. So that, there is also the advice. We need to discuss it openly, democratically. Lastly, I think we also need back home in Africa, we need to rethink our economy. What Edward is saying is true. We can't talk about, exiting debt when our economies are weak. We need to look at, to rethink structural transformation. For example, we have the Continental Free Trade Area. Is it going to work? Will it help us? So we need to rethink our economy. And lastly, I liked the issue of defaulting. I remember I'd say we think outside the box, during the Jubilee campaign, some of you were not there. There was the issue of the odious. We categorized the debt, illegitimate and odious debt. So that one we are not paying, because you can't lend to a government which is dictatorial, which is going to oppress us, and you expect us to pay. And that's why we have been raising the issue of responsible lenders, responsible borrowing, responsible lending. Thank you.
Thank you very much to my fantastic and energetic panel, and for some very exciting conversations, and to all of you for your very energetic contributions and creative contributions as well, that will certainly help us with our advocacy and rethinking the global financial architecture and the strategies therein. It's been amazing hosting this session, and We look forward to an exciting remaining of the week. So enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you very much.